Northern California, almost as far as you can go before you hit the Oregon border, on the coastal side of California, where the forest meets the sea. In the small town of Crescent City, there are many beautiful and magical things to experience, but there's also a side filled with darkness, loss, and mysteries that will likely remain mysteries always. Incidents that will never be solved, questions that will never be answered, and people left wondering. At this point, we've looked at some cases that have taken place here, and we can see that the forest is just a beautiful magical dump site, and the equally beautiful ocean will swallow you whole, and you'll never be seen again, regardless of how your body enters the water. Aside from the ocean, there are many other bodies of water that flow through these lands, including rivers and lakes. One such lake being Lake Earl, where almost 2 centuries ago the Ichule massacre took place, and the waters ran red with the blood of the indigenous who were slaughtered in it. On June 2nd of 2019, it was a beautiful sunny day, perfect for taking a kayak out on the lake, which is exactly what Tasha decided to do. But she didn't do so alone. She had decided to take a friend out with her, and around 1 p.m., the 2 friends would launch the kayak into the waters of Lake Earl, which is located a few miles north of Crescent City, just south of the Oregon border. Even though the lake is in the name, Lake Earl, it's actually a lagoon. It's about 2,000 acres of open water that are 8 to 14 foot deep, and it contains additional sublagoons known as lobes, surrounded by 2,000 acres of wetlands. The smaller lobe of Lake Earl is closer to the ocean and is known as Talawa Lake. The much larger lobe is what's called Lake Earl. Talawa Lake has a much higher saltwater content, as the only thing separating it from the ocean is a sandbar, and it's fairly small, so seawater can flow over into this part of the lagoon. Lake Earl is further away from the ocean and is a separate lobe that doesn't allow much salt water in, and containing mostly fresh waters that are generally calm. So even though it contains some salt water and there's only a sandbar separating the ocean from the lagoon, the 2 water sources behave very differently. A lagoon does not have tides or waves. It's very still and calm waters, especially on a clear sunny day like June 2nd of 2019. The mixture of wetlands and the lagoon itself make this an outdoors person dream. Providing fishing, bird watching, and duck hunting. It's not used much for kayaking or swimming, but it can be used for those purposes, and jet skiing and jet boat type activities are not allowed on the lagoon. Even though there are acres of wetlands surrounding Lake Earl, the wetlands do not completely surround it. Many areas around Lake Earl have been turned into housing tracts and have roads that lead from these clusters of houses down to the lagoon, and one such road that leads down to the lagoon is also the road where Tasha lived, or the house that she was staying in was located. So these 2 friends set out. They're taking advantage of this beautiful day. They launch the kayak into the waters of Lake Earl. They start paddling around and doing what kayakers do, but suddenly Tasha feels like her legs are getting wet, which, if you know how boats and watercraft operate, you know water being inside is not a good thing. Tasha and her friend look down, and they're definitely taking on water, and the kayak starts to sink. Both of them bail out, but the water is too deep for either of them to touch the bottom, so their only choice is to try to swim back to shore, and unfortunately only one of them would make it back. In news articles, it said that the kayak developed a hole, but it was never said what the cause of the hole was. If it was already there, likely they would have known before entering the water, and if something happened while they were on the water, they would have also known, and since one of them made it back to land, it shouldn't be a mystery, but for quote-unquote unknown reasons, the kayak containing these 2 friends started to take on water and sink, leaving them both scared and swimming for their lives. The lagoon is 8 to 14 feet deep, so you can't touch the bottom anywhere except near the shoreline. so walking back would not have been an option for these two. And after 2 hours of fighting treacherous waters, Tasha's friend would make it back to shore, but unfortunately he had, quote unquote, lost track of her. And once her friend made it to shore, he immediately called for help, and a massive search and rescue operation had begun for the mother of four. Now, being that Delnorte County is home to some sandy beaches that are a yearly tourist attraction, and the harbor that's home to many boats that routinely voyage out to rough seas for the various fishing and crabbing seasons, not to mention the rivers that give people access to do rafting, kayaking in the river, and also forest expeditions, Delnorte County has a fairly experienced search and rescue team. And when the search for Tasha was started, they utilized every available means of searching that they could. The Coast Guard launched helicopters, boats, and ATVs. The sheriff brought deputies with canines to assist, and countless local volunteers would search night and day for nearly a week until Tasha was found. There are conflicting versions of the story. Some say they went out early afternoon, some say later in the day, more late afternoon, evening time, and that the search efforts started around 1 a.m., technically Monday morning on June 3rd. The search teams recovered the two-person kayak that Tasha and her friend had taken out only one day after the search efforts began, so it was found Tuesday, June 4th. And despite all hope that Tasha would be found alive, her body would be recovered from the lagoon 4 days later on June 8th, almost exactly 1 week after she had set out to enjoy a beautiful day kayaking with her friend, and her death was labeled a tragic accident. There was never any report in any of the newspaper articles or any of the articles saying what had caused the kayak to sink, but it seems pretty cut and dry that this incident was nothing more than a tragic accident that ended in the horrible, untimely death of Tasha and her friend fighting to save his own life, and he was just not able to save them both. After reading all of the news stories about this incident, and by all I mean 3, there are a lot of discrepancies in the stories, such as timing. Her date of death is listed as the day her body was found, which is kind of odd because it would have been days and days later, so her date of death likely wasn't the day that she was found. She had likely been deceased already for a while. There's just a lot of red flag statements made that might not mean anything to Joe Blow newsreader, but if you know the area, it just makes you immediately think that sounds questionable, and pair that with some insider knowledge about Tasha and her, quote, friend, and things really start not adding up, making this tragic accident seem not so accidental. So for you to understand why it doesn't quite add up to just a tragic accident, let's review some information and see if these discrepancies also make you go, For starters, the news reports on this state they entered the waters early afternoon around 1 p.m. Another says late afternoon, evening-ish time, and the search effort started Sunday evening on 6/2. The other says 1 a.m. on Monday 6/3 when she went missing, insinuating that she didn't even go missing until around that time. Some of these discrepancies could be her companion's story changing or news outlets just guessing the timelines. But in the neighborhoods that surround the lagoon, the people had information that shed some light on why search and rescue efforts didn't start until Monday morning, also why this is likely no accident. One of the biggest things to look at is how it's stated in certain reports that a short time after entering the lagoon, the kayak developed a leak and sank. That's a direct quote from one of the reports. But her companion is also said to have been fighting the cold waters and wind for hours. Another direct quote. So in these two statements, there's a lot to cover. First, they say the kayak developed a leak a short time after entering the water, Yet her companion fought cold water and wind for hours. So they must have been superhuman Hulk smash rowing that kayak for it to take her companion hours to get back to shore if the kayak got a leak and started sinking not too long after entering the water, or there's something wrong with this story. Now, remember before when I was describing the specs of the lagoon as covering 2,000 acres and being up to 14 feet deep? Well, that makes it sound huge. But when you can see the layout and have seen it in person, you can see that most places on the lagoon, you can actually see across to the other side, and it would maybe take 30 minutes to swim across it on a bad day, but it wasn't a bad day. It was sunny, beautiful, clear, and it would have been light out at that time frame. They're stating the incident occurred. So this time of year here, it doesn't get dark until well after 9 p.m. The sun set at 8:46 p.m. on June 2nd of 2019, and it takes a while after sunset for it to be completely dark. So late afternoon, early evening time, it would have been completely light out, and he would have been able to easily see and reach the shoreline. Not to mention the statement that he lost track of her. It's broad daylight, and Tasha was an excellent swimmer according to her family, which makes sense because in Crescent City there are lakes, rivers, oceans, and we swim in them all. So the rivers have currents and rapids, and the ocean can pull you under in a second. So a calm lagoon, that's not much effort for an experienced swimmer to navigate through. So why was Tasha, who on top of being an excellent swimmer, was much younger and in better shape than her companion, yet she was unable to make it to shore, and he did? Another thing to consider is that Lake Earl is surrounded by housing tracts, so once her friend made it to shore, he could have found her help immediately. The kayak also contains more questions than answers. So the kayak was found Tuesday on the 4th of June, so 2 days after it, quote, sank. Tasha's body was found on June 8th, and there was an article generated on June 10th headlining that the body of the missing kayaker on Lake Earl had been found, but still no mention of how the hole and leak came to exist in the kayak, even after almost a week to obtain the information. We're just still left believing that this kayak magically developed a hole and sank. Now for a little kayak knowledge. Kayaks, especially the two-person kayaks, are very unlikely to sink. According to paddlecamp.com, a direct quote, "A sit-on-top kayak is like a one-piece pontoon, and some people call them unsinkable." They also mention in the same information guide that modern-day kayaks are designed to prevent sinking even when filled with water. It will take a lot of water filling up your kayak or some serious damage to the hull. Mind you, kayaks are made to be taken out into the ocean or down rivers with level 5 rapids and large rocks. So a super calm lagoon made of just mud and sand is not going to be rough enough to break the hull once out in the water, causing enough damage to sink it. The other component of sinking is weight limits, and for a two-person kayak, the weight limit is 500 to 700 pounds. With Tasha being petite and her companion being on the smaller side for a male, there's no way these limitations were exceeded. Now it's time for some fun facts about Tasha's friend that make things even more interesting. Her companion that she chose to go kayaking with used to date her aunt and has been a hardcore drug addict for decades. He has a history of domestic violence towards Tasha's aunt and his previous wife. He had also had his children legally removed from his care due to his drug addiction and is still an active user. And after this incident, he moved away from Crescent City, which has been his home for decades. But after this accident occurred, he just up and leaves. But people move, and that's not necessarily a sign of guilt, but awfully suspicious with the timing. Now, is Tasha a completely innocent person? Many girls from Crescent City fall victim to the lack of activities and end up doing things that bored teenagers with nothing better to do end up doing. In the early 2000s, Crescent City was said to have a higher teen pregnancy and drug usage rate than all of Sacramento, California, with Crescent City only having a population of 10,000 people. These stats are outrageous, and the youth of this town just don't stand a chance. They're more likely than not to fall victim to this lifestyle, and the statistics of successfully overcoming it are 2%. Does that mean that Tasha deserved to die because she was a young mother and made some less than perfect life choices? Absolutely not. Does it mean that this should be labeled an accident and not investigated further just because of who she was or things she had done in the past? No. Every life matters, and every person that loses their life at the hands of another deserves justice. The unfortunate truth is that far too often crimes against natives just don't get solved or even looked at. Natives have always been considered expendable, and their lives hold such little value that murders with heaping piles of evidence go cold, and others get labeled as accidents, so there's no obligation to solve anything at all. Tasha's family had even brought some information to authorities, and the authorities didn't receive the information well. In fact, just the opposite. Instead of taking the information as coming from a family who had lost a loved one and believes there's more to the story, even if they don't think it can go anywhere or doesn't meet the criteria for an investigation, they could have said, "I'll look into that, thank you for letting us know." Instead, it was taken as a personal attack, and they told this grieving family, "Don't tell me how to do my job." Verbatim. That's exactly what they said to them. So, other things to take note of here are her date of death, being listed as the day they found her remains, which was June 8th, almost a full week after she went missing. Saying they found her remains implies she already passed on, but the information says she died that day, not before she was found. Did they not do an autopsy to find a more accurate time of death? Even if they didn't, there are different ways to estimate one's time of death, such as the state of the body and the fact that it takes a victim of drowning about a week for bacteria in the gut to die off and release the gases that cause a dead body to float, which is likely why they found her body a week later. But this doesn't mean that she only passed on the day that they found her. It just seems to speak to the allowance of inaccuracy and the lack of care to even find the specific day that she had passed away. With all of this information, it's really hard to think that anyone would believe this was just an accident. But now I'm going to go all Billy Mays on you. But wait, there's more. There were various reports of hearing gunshots that sounded like they were coming from on the lake. Now, from what we know about kayaks and sinking, blowing a hole in the side of the kayak with a gun would cause the severe damage those experts are talking about, which would allow one of these unsinkable vessels to sink. So now I'm going to recreate the events that likely took place that Sunday out on the lagoon known as Lake Earl. Tasha was staying at her grandmother's house on Lakeview Drive. Her grandmother had passed away and the house was empty. The reason Drew would have been there is unclear, but one thing is very clear: they were not friends. Maybe he thought she had something that she didn't, but they weren't in a friendship or relationship of any kind, and they're definitely not the type to go kayaking together on the lake. It was very late on June 2nd, and they had driven down to the lake or near the lake to talk, as Tasha didn't want him in her house. Suddenly, a disagreement takes place between Tasha and Drew. Drew gets angry, and though Tasha is little and petite, she's not one to back down. So standing her ground but realizing she may need an equalizer, given Drew's history of beating on women, she grabs a gun to intimidate him and maybe stop this fight from progressing. But it doesn't, and this angers him even further, and he lunges at her and takes the gun. Tasha is willing to stand her ground, but her flight response kicks in, and she flings the car door open and runs down the road. It's dark and late, so most people in the area are in bed, and the area around the lake is far back and secluded. So Tasha gets down to the lake and sees the kayak, and in a split-second decision launches it into the water, jumping on, creating distance between her and Drew. Knowing he doesn't have a boat to come out there and get her, she thinks maybe he'll go away and calm down. But this does the opposite again and angers him even more, as he's someone who just sees red when he's upset. He sees Tasha floating away in the kayak and looks down to the gun in his hand. Without hesitation, he holds the gun up, taking aim at Tasha, cocks the hammer back, loading a bullet into the chamber, and fires, missing Tasha but blowing a hole in the hull of the kayak. The kayak Tasha thought was her life raft to escape Drew was now taking on water. Tasha quickly thinks and rolls out of the kayak, slinking behind it to take cover. While she's thinking quickly, so is Drew. But the thoughts he's having are not, oh my God, what am I doing? I should stop and just take off. If I shoot her, I'll be charged with murder. Ultimately, he thinks to get rid of the gun, and he runs full speed ahead and dives into the water, quickly making it to the kayak, where he can hear Tasha gasping for air behind it. And the kayak has now taken on enough water to start to sink. Tasha's already injured from another accident that occurred a few days before, and her ribs are fractured, so it's painful just to breathe, let alone swim and escape the attack that is likely about to take place. Drew reaches Tasha, and with her being injured and tired, she doesn't have much fight left in her, and soon Tasha and the kayak are both underwater. Drew then swims to shore and takes the gun, all of her belongings, back to her grandma's house, and then soaking wet goes and calls for help, telling the dispatcher the story. That would be the headliner of the local news for the next week, until her body was found almost a week later. And that's going to do it for today. I really hope you enjoyed hearing this story as much as I enjoyed telling it. Please do realize the last portion of the story is a fabricated version of events created by me based on what I think was likely to have happened. I have had conversations with close family members who also believe that it was not an accident, and what is being told by news outlets and various other sources is inaccurate, and they do believe that her life was taken by her kayaking companion out there on the lake that night. And now comes the time where you know what to do. Like, love, comment, share, subscribe, turn on notifications so you never miss an installment. Thanks for being here.